This advantage of bribery by money is, however, usually counterbalanced by the drastic degradation of the people concerned if the case becomes known. There is a distinctive parallel here with theft. Servants steal money less frequently, that is only where they are extremely demoralized, than they do food or other trifles. Some such experiences indicate that they flinch from stealing amounts of money that are equal to a bottle of wine or a toilet article which they would appropriate without any scruples. Accordingly, from this standpoint, our penal code considers stealing a small amount of food and consumer goods for direct use to be only a slight violation of the law, whereas the theft of an equivalent amount of money would be severely punished. It is obviously assumed that in the case of a momentary need the availability of the respective commodity is so tempting that to succumb is too human a frailty to be punished severely. The more the object is distanced from its immediate use and the longer the detour necessary to satisfy the need, the weaker is the attraction, and the greater is the degree of immorality involved in satisfying the impulse to steal it. Therefore, according to a decision of the highest court, heating material, for example, is not considered to be in the same category as food and is not subject to the same reduction of punishment. Undoubtedly, the need for heat may be just as urgent a need and just as necessary for survival as bread, but its use is certainly less direct than that of bread. There are more intermediate stages on the way to survival, and it is only fair to assume that the tempted person has more time for reflection than would otherwise be possible for more immediate needs. Money is the farthest removed from such direct enjoyments. The interest is always focused on what lies behind it, so that the temptation that, as it were, radiates from it is not a natural instinct and does not possess the force of such an instinct to act as an excuse for succumbing to it. Therefore, just as with the theft of money, so bribery by money appears as opposed to an immediately enjoyable value as the symptom of shrewder and more thoroughly corrupted moral standards, so that the secrecy that the nature of money makes possible acts as a kind of protection for the subject. Inasmuch as it represents a tribute to the sense of shame, it belongs to a familiar type, that immoral behavior is combined with a set of moral factors, not in order to reduce the total amount of immorality, but rather to be able to realize it. Here too it is evident that money that exceeds a certain quantity changes its qualitative characteristics. There are gigantic briberies that expediently change that security device and dispense with secrecy, to the extent that it is technically impossible to uphold it, by giving them an official character. During the 20 years between the granting of legislative and administrative independence of Ireland and the union with England, the English ministers were confronted with the apparently insoluble problem of governing two different states with a uniform policy and of establishing harmony between two independent legislatures. They found a solution in permanent bribery. All the various trends in the Irish Parliament were brought together into the desired unity simply by buying the votes. Thus one of the greatest admirers of Robert Walpole stated, he himself was absolutely incorruptible, but to attain his political ends, which were wise and just, he was willing to bribe the whole lower house, and he would not have recoiled from bribing a whole nation. How the clearest conscience with regard to bribes, a conscience proud of its own moral standards, can coexist together with the passionate condemnation of bribery is indicated by the statement of a Florentine bishop at the height of the medieval struggle against simony. He wished to buy the papal chair, even at the price of £1,000, only in order to drive out the cursed simonists. And perhaps the most striking example of the fact that it is the tremendous measure of sums of money that removes the stigma of shamelessness and of secrecy from bribery as it does from prostitution is this. The biggest financial transaction of early modern times was the procurement of financial means that Charles V required in order to bribe the people for his election as emperor. In addition, the extraordinary height of purchase prices for goods that should not be subject to such trade often provides a certain guarantee that the public interest does not suffer too much damage. The fact that English kings used to sell the important public offices at least had the effect that the buyer strove to behave well. It was stated that a man who had paid £10,000 for the seals was not likely to forfeit them for the sake of a petty malversation which many rivals would be ready to detect. Just as I stated earlier that the secrecy of bribery is a safety device for the subject, so publicity is a corresponding safety device for public interests. This is the corrective through which these gigantic corruptions were legitimized to some extent. They were not allowed to be hidden and thus one could, as it were, come to terms with them. For this reason, bribes are easier to bear under simple circumstances. It has been emphasized as something unheard of that Aristides, despite his many discretionary powers, died a poor man. In the small ancient city-states, the dishonesty of a single person did not yet shake the foundations of the whole society, because only a very small part was based on a money economy and because relationships were transparent and uncomplicated and could easily be kept in balance. Therefore it has been rightly said that the fate of Athens was every day dependent upon the decisions on the Knicks. Under the modern highly complex circumstances of public life with its innumerable subterranean forces of the money economy that extend in all directions, the bribery of officials has much more detrimental effects. In all the cases mentioned so far, we have dealt with the sale of values of a personal but not subjective nature and, by safeguarding them, the person experiences an objective value in them in contrast to the values of subjective enjoyment. That the complex of life forces that are vested in marriage thereby coincide with the direction of our own instincts, that the woman surrenders only if the man responds with similar emotions, that words and deeds are the corresponding expression of convictions and obligations, all this signifies not so much a value that we have but a value that we are. By surrendering all this for money, one exchanges one's being against one's possessing. Certainly both concepts are interrelated, for all the contents of our existence present themselves to us as possession of that purely formal, insubstantial center that we experience as our centrifugal ego and as the owning subject, in contrast to the objects owned in terms of qualities, interests and emotions. On the other hand, possessions are, as we saw, an extension of our sphere of influence, a power of disposal over objects which thereby enters into the circle of our ego. The ego, our desires and feelings, continues to live in the objects we own. On the one hand, the innermost core of the ego, inasmuch as it is a single definite capacity, is located outside the center as an objective ownership belonging to its central point. On the other, even the most extraneous factors, if they are true possessions, rest within the ego. In owning the objects, the ego becomes competent to deal with them, and without any one of them it would change into something else. Looked at logically and psychologically, it would therefore be arbitrary to draw a dividing line between being and owning. If we nonetheless consider it to be objectively justified, then this is because being and owning, in terms of the distinction between them, are not theoretical objective concepts, but value concepts. If we designate our being as being different from our owning, we attribute a certain kind of value and standard of value to our contents of life. If one interprets those that lie close to the enigmatic center of the ego as our being and the more remote ones as our owning, then their arrangement in this series, excluding, of course, any sharp demarcation, is only produced through the diversity of feelings of value that accompanies both of them. If in any transaction we allocate what we give away to our being and what we receive to our owning, then this is only an indirect expression of the fact that we have exchanged a more intensive, more durable sense of value which permeates the whole sphere of life for a more direct, urgent and momentary one. Money and the ideal of distinction. If the sale of personal values implies a diminution of this specific being in the sense used here and the direct opposite of self-respect, then we may term a personal ideal which can serve as a decisive yardstick for those modes of behavior one of distinction, Bornamite. This value is decisive because it signifies the most radical criterion in money matters. Measured against it, prostitution, marriage for money and bribery are the extreme points of a series that commences with the most legitimate forms of money transactions. To explain this phenomenon we have first to define the concept of distinction itself. The usual division of our objective norms of valuation into logical, ethical and aesthetic norms is quite incomplete when viewed in the light